Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Energy Pathways USA briefing on the recently passed power sector regulations. I'm Jackson Ewing. I'm the Director of Energy and Climate Policy at the Nicholas Institute for Energy, Environment, and Sustainability, where we act as the Secretariat for Energy Pathways USA, which is a regional wing of the Energy Transitions Commission. We work with policymakers and firms across key sectors to help advance decarbonization. And for anyone who wants to learn more about that, we'll put a link in the chat. We're going to get right to it today and hear from Tim Profeta, who's currently a senior fellow and was formerly the founding director of the Nicholas Institute. Tim returned to us last year after 2 years as special counsel at the EPA, where he worked to develop a raft of different power sector regulatory strategies, including the regulations at the center of our discussion today. Few are better placed than Tim to unpack the nature of these regulations and where they might be headed. Tim's going to give initial thoughts over the first half of the session, and then we're going to move into a discussion. We have many people in the room who have plenty to say about this, and we look forward to hearing from you. Please use the Q&A function at any point. Do not feel like you need to wait for that discussion to begin. I'll be curating those questions and lobbing them to Tim. If anything comes through that requires immediate clarification, I will interrupt and we'll get that answer to you right away. With that, Tim, over to you.
Thank you, Jackson. Greetings to all, and let me just get the slideshow up. As Jackson noted, I just returned to the Duke University and the Nicholas Institute this fall after spending 2 great years at EPA as a special counsel for the power sector. In that capacity, I worked with many of my capable colleagues in the 111 regulatory process through the proposal stage, and then as they've moved towards finalization, I've been here at the Institute. But happy to sort of give my description and perspectives on the rules that were finalized, last month by EPA for greenhouse gases for EPA power plant regulations. One thing to note is that when these regulations came out, they also came out in conjunction with several other regulations that we're not going to speak about today, but they came out with the Office of Water's ELG regulations for coal plants, the coal ash regulations, so all which was trying to be in keeping with the strategy that was announced by the Minister of EPA in March of 2022 to give a sort of comprehensive view of the regulatory requirements of the power sector, so those in the sector can make efficient decisions with a full knowledge of the investments that would be required to comply with all of EPA's regulations, not just them having to adjust to them serially as they came through. But we're going to focus today on the power plant regulations for greenhouse gases, or as people call them, the Section 111 regulations for greenhouse gases for power plants. Just want to frame up a few key things to keep in mind as we go through these regulations. First, I think a good frame to think about the regulations is that the agency was trying to create a rule that appreciated a sector that was under dynamic transition and was trying to work with the sector to create the most efficient investment paths they could on the pollution control that they were required to pursue under the Clean Air Act. So for the existing fleet, and particularly the existing coal fleet, EPA was trying to write a rule that allowed for the pre-existing coal transition to happen without requiring additional short-term pollution control investment in those plants. So if you were, to make it more explicit, if you're a plant operator and thinking that you would, or maybe have already announced that you're going to cease operations of a plant by 2030, the EPA was trying to write a rule that you didn't require you to plow new pollution control equipment into that plant that didn't have enough time to recover the costs on. The second thing, with a new turbine rule, EPA was trying to create a rule that ensured that the rule now would not create a number of fossil fuel and greenhouse gas emitting assets that would then be vulnerable to being stranded assets 10 years from now when the country tried to reach further ambition on greenhouse gases. So they tried to write a rule that sort of forecast a path of technology, and we'll see how they try to execute that. Second thing I want people, and I think it's always very important for people to keep in mind when it comes to the regulations of the Clean Air Act, they are based on assessment of technology, but compliance does not need to be achieved through the installation of the same technologies that EPA assessed. More explicitly, EPA set some of these emission limits for plants based on the idea that a plant could install carbon control and sequestration controls. However, a plant could meet, or an operator can meet those standards through any other technology or any other approach they want to take to get the requisite pollution reductions. It doesn't have to be the same. So, and often in these debates, we get very focused on what EPA looked at in terms of the technology. That's what they're required to do in the Clean Air Act, but it doesn't mean that compliance has to come that way. Third, I think, also underappreciated is the massive role that states have in executing the rule for existing sources. That was all done through a state planning process, and we'll talk about how some of the flexibilities the EPA really explicitly called out that the states have and how to execute and meet the standards. And finally, I think, EPA, we should really flag that EPA inserts significant provisions in the rule to provide safeguards against the reliability concerns about this rule that were really being raised far and wide when the proposal came out. So the final rule sort of has 4 severable components. I'm really going to focus on just the top 2 of these. These are, by the way, slides, a few I borrowed from my colleague Carrie Jenks at Harvard Law School, and I thank Carrie in absentia for putting these together. We're really going to focus on the first 2 items, which are the existing coal-fired power plant rule and the new gas power plant rule. These rules were finalized, as I said, last month, and they are final rules, which means they are controlling law in the country unless they are stayed by the courts, and there will be inevitable proposals to do that. But unless stayed by a court, these are the controlling law of the United States now as they've been finalized. First, though, let's talk about what's not in the rule. Earlier this year, EPA announced that it was not going to finalize the third piece of the third leg of the stool of its proposal, which was the rule for existing gas fleets. EPA had proposed that there be a requirement for those plants, existing gas turbine fleet, to meet either a hydrogen-based or a CCS-based standard in the 2030s, but only for the largest plants, which were 50% capacity factor above. There's a lot of critiques of that rule. One of the more common critiques that came across that it allowed for gaming, and a lot of people would cycle down their plants to 49% capacity factors to avoid the regulation entirely. Whether for that critique or others, EPA decided that it wanted to refocus and reassess this rule and announced a new non-regulatory docket to get comments on how it should approach that part of the fleet. I think the sentence, I excerpted their presentation, which discussed this on the screen right now. The sentence I focus on is that they're working for a broader, more environmentally protective approach that covers the entire fleet. I think that really they're looking at something, can they get more reductions to proposal would have gotten and be more efficient and cover all the plants so you don't have the gameability problems. One other thing to say on the existing gas docket is that we are going to have a stakeholder event to receive input. And I said we, because EPA has asked myself and several colleagues from Georgetown and Harvard to facilitate a discussion with stakeholders about how they should retackle this part of the power sector. But let's now move back to what was finalized last month, and let's start with the existing coal standards. Across these both these rules, what you're going to see EPA tried to do, we all know this is the third bite at the apple for EPA regarding the creation of greenhouse gas rules under the Clean Air Act. And after the West Virginia v. EPA opinion came down in 2022, really clarifying EPA's authority. What EPA has turned to is really a use of subcategories to try and provide some of the flexibility that the sector desires in terms of its future, but then apply for each subcategory, a technology-based standard they think is justified under the strictures of the Clean Air Act. More explicitly, what EPA has done here is they've looked temporally at the lifespan of coal plants and assessing what is a cost reasonable technology you expect a plant to invest in, given the projected lifespan of that plant. Because what cost reasonableness is part of the process for EPA, and if a plant is only going to be around for X years, there may not be enough time to recover costs, so that technology wouldn't be justified. So then they would look at a more cost reasonable technology, etc. In the end, EPA finalized 2 subcategories for existing coal standards. They had originally had 4, and functionally done the same thing. The first 2 from the proposal were in the early retirement subcategory, one that for any plant retiring before 2032, and the other for a plant that was going to retire by 2035, but limit itself to a 20% capacity factor for the last 5 years of its life. I think EPA realized that last category, the 2035 low capacity plant, no one really was interested in it. And the 2032, there was no reason to create a subcategory because what they've done here is just said that those plants are not subject to the final rule. So if a coal asset is retiring by 2032, there is no regulatory obligation on this rule. The states will have to reflect that in their state plan that those plants are committing to retire. If the plant is not retiring by 2032 but will retire by 2039, EPA did not find that CCS was the technology-based standard. Instead, they found that what was a reasonable expectation of that plant was to co-fire with a standard that was equivalent to co-firing with 40% natural gas, a 16% emissions reduction for that plant. And then finally, if a plant is projected to operate in perpetuity, EPA then has found that CCS is a demonstrated technology. So carbon capture and sequestration in geological storage is the required technology. And by 2032, that plant would be expected to meet that rate, which is 88.4% emissions reduction at that plant. One change here you'll see here is that in reaction to the comments that got EPA pushed the compliance date back for that CCS standard. Originally, it was the plant would have to be doing carbon capture and sequestration at that rate by 2030. It pushed that to 2032. The other major rule that was finalized was a new gas standard for new gas turbines. This was, again, using a subcategory approach to think about different usage patterns for these plants and how they would justify the economics of different control technologies. But instead, for a new turbine, instead of like a retirement pathway, EPA created subcategories based on their capacity factors. It's something they've done before for this category, so it wasn't novel in any way. From the proposal, there were several significant changes. One is the baseload natural gas subcategory now is defined as anything 40% and above. It was originally 50% above. One of the biggest changes was it had 2 different technologies and 2 different pathways one could take on the technologies in the proposal. You could either build a turbine that was projected to reach the emission reduction levels through hydrogen on a sort of pathway EPA was forecasting for hydrogen, or a pathway forecast for CCS. EPA has dropped hydrogen as a technology to justify this standard. This is based on the ability to apply CCS at these plants. And so for the base load plants, you have to meet a emissions, highly efficient turbine emissions level upon the building and the plant. As you see here, for anything above 2,000 MMBTU, it's a 800 pounds per megawatt hour standard. And then meet a CCS 90% capture standard by 2032 for that plant. The two other subcategories don't carry that second phase. The intermediate subcategory, which is about 20 to 40% capacity, has to do with a level that's really a highly efficient combustion turbine, simple cycle combustion turbine standard. And then lastly, there is a category for the peaking units. That's this low emitting fuel standard that's been there for as a pre-existing standard, and that's basically maintained. Couple other things to make sure we put on the table about the new gas standards. One is the 111B provision, which is authority under which EPA is required to do these standards, applies to any plant that is under construction past, in this case, May 23rd, 2023. The way that the Clean Air Act was drafted and executed, Congress did not want people rushing to build plants while they waited for the plants to finalize. So the actual rule becomes effective the date of the proposal, when people are given notice of what the proposal could be. So any plant that's under construction after that date, these standards apply to. As I noted, there's no hydrogen technology standard here, but again, hydrogen could be a compliance means. Co-firing hydrogen or moving towards a hydrogen-fired turbine is a means that could be used to comply with this regulation. And I bring that up because one of the things that was controversial in the proposal was what type of hydrogen? Do you have to have green hydrogen? Do you have to think of the upstream emissions for hydrogen? EPA is not doing that here. They are saying there's no requirements for hydrogen if you use it as a compliance mechanism. And lastly, we're seeing some concern that already in commentary that there might be some issues about gaming here, that people again would build turbines and run them at 39% capacity to avoid that CCS tight standard for the baseload category. If you look at the IPM runs that EPA submitted with the rule, it didn't show any turbines with CCS being built. However, there are a number of projects that are out there already announcing they're going to build these, and the EPA, talking to them, also reminds us that those 39% turbines not only have to compete with another turbine, a baseload turbine, they have to compete with all the other generation options one could look at for compliance with the rule. I'm not going to talk off the slide. I just want to show the slide to the audience. This is available at the link at the bottom of the page. This is a chart that goes through in much more detail everything I just went through for the rules. And if you think visually and you think in the chart, I think it's a very handy resource that the agency put on the web for everybody to be able to utilize. Now I want to move to the state process and the important role of states in executing the existing source rule, the existing coal rule. Just like many other provisions of the Clean Air Act, the 111D rules are executed through a cooperative federalist approach. EPA creates that standard performance, the one we just discussed, for different subcategories at either the CCS or the natural gas co-firing level. And then states are required to put plans together that meet those standards of performance. EPA announced it was a 24-month process, which is actually changed from their baseline regulations governing the state planning processes. Usually it's an 18-month process. And in doing that, if you look at the language and description to the states, there's a strong stress on transparency of the planning process and meaningful engagement of all communities, energy communities, low-income communities, the industry, in the construction of those regulations. Also in there, you will see a strong proactive discussion of the state's authority to consider remaining useful life and other factors in the creation of their state plans. EPA creates the default assumption standard performance for these plants, but states have the authority to diverge if they find that it's justified because of the remaining useful life of plants or other factors. This is an acronym that people call RULOF, and for those who hate acronyms, I apologize. Some of the limiting language in what's in the regulation, though, is that there needs to be EPA reminds that there needs to be a fundamental difference between what the state's facing under here and from what EPA assessed in terms of feasibility of the standard. And there's language that says this is a limited variance capability, but nonetheless, they do point out that there's a flexibility in this step in the process for states to work with plant owners who are trying to navigate these these standards. And so if you're serious about CCS, for example, and you're not sure you can meet the 2032 target, but you think you might want to pursue that as an option, this is the authority where you should engage your state and the region and say, can we work something out that can bring that CCS plant up to scale and get it on the grid in a doable schedule.
Hey, Tim, I'm going to jump in with a clarifying question, if I may. This is from Cynthia Burbank, and she's asking about how the regulations or whether the regulations directly or indirectly affect diesel generators, especially those that are used at data centers. And she notes that utilities have been talking to data centers to put plans in place for DCs to shift over to their massive diesel generators in the event of grid stress. So these diesel generators would serve essentially as peaker plants. Any sense on that question?
It's a great question. I think it's one we should take under consideration and get back to any who are interested on it. There are definitely standards here for the boilers and using oil and petroleum products, but I don't recall that they created a diesel generator rule in this package. Now there's default rules for regulation of those. I can't speak with authority on it right off the cuff.
All right, thanks. Please.
Yep. All right. So a couple other things to note on the state planning processes. EPA is calling for clear increments of progress. As EPA created these standards, and particularly the standards that suppose that a plant is going to retire or on a certain date, EPA wants to ensure that those who are opting for those subcategories are executing those strategies. So state plan will have to really incorporate the increments of progress to show that things are moving in a direction that were forecast. And then there's a number of flexibility mechanisms that are allowed. Trading and averaging across the fleet are allowed, and that's if your state had one coal plant, that's not as dramatic a provision, but for a state with multiple units, it provides a capability to do trading and averaging and sort of smooth out some of the transition costs. There are provisions to require backstop rates, minimal rates at each plant. For example, the default limit for that CCS category of coal plants is the backstop emissions limit times 80% capacity factor. Actually, that's not the rate. The other provision is the mass-based limits that EPA has explicitly allowed here, both across the suite of units, and in response to a lot of comments, they're allowing a mass-based unit-specific limit, and they have that default limit from the CCS category I just described for the long-term coal assets. They did not determine a way to calculate a mass-based limit for intermediate unit, and they couldn't come to grips with exactly what would be the right number, so they've asked states to propose one to them. Lastly, EPA did put a lot of investment in the creation of reliability provisions, given the commentary they got in the comment period on concerns about reliability in the grid. They sort of have this 4-point plan. This is also directly excerpted from their presentation. They first of all point out that they changed the rule to allow a little more time to streamline things, to give a little bit more flexibility. They did articulate this rule-off provision and how that can be used in state plans. They created the flexibilities that we just discussed, and they created 2 optional reliability-related instruments that can be included in the state plan by the states. There's kind of a short-term one and a long-term one. The short-term mechanism is really, intended for a situation where, you have a NERC level 2 or 3 emergency, and pretty much allows plants to operate out of compliance with their this program in that short-term time window, to make sure that that they don't frustrate the ability to service a reliability need in those instances. I think the more difficult and more thoughtful approach EPA is taking is the reliability assurance mechanism on the right side of this chart. Again, this is from EPA's own presentation. This is a situation where you have sort of a resource adequacy question for your grid that you can see emerging, yet your transformers are on a boat in China and they're not coming anytime soon, and that the situation is not going to allow you to make the transition to another source of generation that you hope that you could. What the EPA says here is that states have a right to do a 1-year mulligan without any intervention, just and then if they are going to, this needs to be longer than the 1 year, then they actually have to reopen that meaningfully, that transparent and state planning process with a meaningful engagement, and change the plan to adjust for this need through their rule-off authority. Lastly, EPA is really leaning pretty heavily here on the partnership they have with DOE and FERC through the MOU on reliability that was signed about a year plus ago, to have FERC help assess these extension requests and the reliability need. Lastly, considerations going forward. Just what I would profit for you is, first, to remind ourselves that the existing gas regulatory process has been rebooted, and it's EPA's indicated intention to finalize a regulation in early 2025 for the existing gas turbines. So particularly for the states who are thinking about what they're going to do with the state plans for the coal thermal units, do they need to be updated? Yes, they would need to be. They'll need to be a state plan for the existing gas, should that be finalized as predicted. And are they brought together? Are they separate? Those are open questions. And as they create their plans for their coal plants, are they creating precedents that then they could apply to the gas fleet should that become regulated? Second, I wrote battle in the PUCs. I foresee that the commissions are going to have a very active debate about how to treat these standards, particularly the new turbine standards and the phasing in, and how does the commission approach assessing the cost of the investment that would underlie these turbines, given the phasing that would be the EPA is required to get to that CCS standard by 2032. Lastly, what are the compliance options that are out there that are other than the BSER? BSER is the technology-based standard, CCS standard, but could you do things with hydrogen? Could you do things with things that are not fossil generation to provide the electric need? And lastly, the the mother of all questions on this is, what is the durability of this proposal? Legally and politically. Politically, I think no one has a monopoly on wisdom as to what will happen politically in the next year and what will the consequences be of this proposal. But if this is a final rule, so if there's no legal intervention, this rule is controlling until in this case, probably a Trump administration would go through the regulatory process of repealing it and replacing it, which would take time. Legally, we know that many have already announced that they will immediately move to file suit against this to try and stay the rule, never let it be in effect, and get it overturned. I will say that EPA has done a really determined approach to try and stay within the bounds of its authority, as was described in West Virginia v. EPA by the Supreme Court. They've also provided these provisions, like the reliability provisions, to really try and avoid any risk of imminent harm from the rule. Those are the sorts of things that go into the standard for granting a stay. I think there will be a lot of litigation and argument on the record of the technologies EPA uses to establish these standards and how much demonstration and deployment of those technologies justify the application of the standard. I think that will be a big litigation item. As for whether a stay will be granted or not, I think in the end, this is a big climate rule, and I think it's really hard to predict based on past precedent anything regarding what the courts will do in the future. So that's the conclusion of my presentation. Jackson, I'm happy to take questions and discuss.
Thanks much, Tim, for such an efficient and comprehensive primer in a short amount of time. Really appreciate it. I want to start with a forward-looking question from our friend Alex Hopkins, who asks about reliability mechanisms, but not for the existing EPA regulations that we've been discussing, but for the upcoming stakeholder input and engagement process for existing gas. Do you see similar reliability mechanisms being on the table there?
Yeah, I think one of the things EPA, if you go back to the four things they said, actually, I'm not sure they said it explicitly, but one of the things EPA indicated is by not finalizing the existing gas fleet and allowing that fleet to sort of service load, that may have been the biggest thing they've done to try and ensure reliability is not threatened by this rule. So for Alex, the reverse of that is an incredibly important issue to navigate as you think about regulating that plant. If you're using those plants to reliably deliver power to the grid, then further regulation of them really needs to think very carefully about how it's done in a way that does not impact reliability. I think that the issues here, this reliability assurance mechanism they created here, the trading mechanisms, the flexibility mechanisms, and the sort of embrace that states have that variant ability to have a variant on the rule-off, also would be mechanisms that the agency would look at again when it starts to move towards finalizing existing gas regulations as ways to avoid concerns about reliability.
Thanks. I have a couple of CCS questions. One of them is for me, so I'll take advantage of my space here and send that one to you first. How did the EPA consider cost differentials across different contexts and geographies on CCS and even possibilities in terms of geological formations and just different sorts of conditions that might make those costs and decisions different in different places?
My memory of the record is that EPA acknowledged that issue exists, but assessed the costs not in terms of geological variability.
Yeah.
I think the EPA, read its authority to say what is a demonstrated technology and what is the cost of delivering that technology, and did its national scale assessment of that to create the standard. I do think that will be one of the questions that will be litigated.
Yeah, certainly. We also have a kind of a compliance verification oriented question on CCS, excuse me. What's the quantum of proof that will be required regarding future compliance capability, et cetera, for CCS, and how is that going to be assessed?
You try and translate that a little more?
Yeah, so I think if I'm interpreting the question correctly, what will the process be by which the EPA will evaluate whether the CCS infrastructure development, investment decisions, planning, et cetera, is going to be up to the challenge of meeting the requirements that it lays out in the regulations when we're looking at a particular plant level?
Well, there's 2 points of compliance, right? EPA knows how much. The first is the rate of CO2 going out the smokestack, and EPA already has continuous emissions monitoring systems on those smokestacks monitoring CO2, and they know how much is going on. So whether the rate is being complied with CCS is a sort of knowable data point for EPA with ease. Then you have the captured CO2 and whether it's being adequately sequestered, and EPA does require, working with the Class 2 and Class 6 permit certification systems to ensure that the CO2 is being sequestered adequately and not re-released through the sequestration.
Yeah, certainly. All right, thanks. Actually, we have a clarification coming in on this. So let me just give a part two to the question. What will the new gas plants have to show to get permitted, essentially, on CCS?
They will have to show. I think it's a good question. I think it's for the states and the EPA to sort of work through. But they will have to show. I mean, I don't know how to say this. A plan for the investment in the equipment and infrastructure necessary to meet the standards in the second phase.
Yeah.
They need to make sure that they have the space if you're going to do post-combustion capture for the equipment on the site. Then they will be required to meet that standard, or they'll be in violation of their permit.
Yeah. Thanks. That's a really useful clarification. I'm glad you talked a good bit about the important role of states in implementation here. What are the considerations, and this doesn't necessarily have to be originating from EPA, but more broadly around state capacity here? Is it the case that we're going to have a capacity building regulation interpretation push, similarly to what we're seeing on IRA execution, for example, and how to manage this new world? Or is it going to be more the case that regulations are there, they're written in a clear fashion, interpret and go forth as you see fit?
Are you saying in terms of the state governments that you need capacity to be able to execute these regulations?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, my colleagues who I work with in the state governments would scream at me if I did not, point out that they are capacity constrained and do have limits to the amount that they can carry. And then one particular colleague in the Southeast I know would want me to point out that they also need a real good partnership with the agency to make sure that when they do create their state plans, they can be approved expeditiously, so they can move. So it may also be on the EPA side, they need the capacity to be able to process and approve these plans with the speed that's required. I think EPA, I think it's a prior regulation. I think the EPA would put priority on being able to meet that moment. I also would reflect that a lot of colleagues I work with in the States are less concerned about that capacity limitation without the existing gas finalization. This is a simpler rule to execute. I mean, the coal fleets, many of them are on, the paths that EPA forecast here. And so, there's not much required other than creating increments of progress towards those paths. I think that's not universal. I think there's some states that have more to do here than others, but there are some states that have no coal plants and found themselves not having to do a state planning process at all. So relative to what this could have looked like if EPA finalized all three legs of the stool, this is a lower capacity requirement on the states.
Yeah, thanks. And Bill Holman asked a related question here, and it brings it a little closer to home for us. As the state of North Carolina has developed a carbon plan, how do you see the relationship between North Carolina's plan and the EPA rule?
Well, Bill, I need to go dig into all the details of the carbon plan. I mean, the carbon plan is really it's a integrated resource plan, and the first thing is, should the pathway, the carbon plan moves a lot away from some of these assets. So to the degree that the schedule and the timing of what the carbon plan is doing lines up with this regulation, then that's simpatico. To the degree that the carbon, that the planning is not quite aligned with the regulations, you might either be looking at a question of, do we amend the plan, or do we ask the state to give a little more flexibility under the rule-off provisions? I think the bigger issue in the state right now is whether to allow new NGCC plants to be built without any control plan, akin to and if that, I actually was thinking about that fleet when the earlier question came in, because it's also not nearby a geological repository for carbon disposal, because North Carolina is not well situated for that. And I think that how aligned or not aligned those NGCC plants that are proposed are with this regulation, I think will be point of a lot of debate.
Yeah, thanks. I'm going to stick on this for one more question, as we do have some others coming in. But in terms of these capacity constraints that your friends in state governments would insist that you highlight here, what do you see as the analytical gaps that need creative solutions for compliance, and what kind of work is needed to help address those? Are we looking at additional modeling, et cetera? And how does the existing gas rule impact the nature of the work that'll be necessary here?
Yeah, I think I'm glad for the delineation of existing gas coming in. As I said, I don't think it's as heavy of a lift until the existing gas rule would be finalized. But once it is, I think it's a very complex question. I think in terms of the regulatory program, I do think that the state plans are put out under the Clean Air Act. I think analytical capacity modeling to assess what is the reliable generating assets you need on the grid, and how can that be planned in a way, and how can flexibility mechanisms help an operator maintain an asset on a sort of schedule that allows new generation to come in. I think that sort of modeling work will be really important. I think actually we need to look at the other things that, one of the things that underlies the transition in the sector is that the IRA and BIL are generating a great deal of investment in non-fossil generation that's coming onto the grid. That's not subject to the regulations here and can't be part of the calculation EPA puts forward, but is in reality a direction that some generators are going to for servicing their market while staying in compliance with this rule. There's a lot of choke points to bring that power onto the grid as well, and there needs to be real capacity investment in electrical engineers to do interconnection onto the grid, in community engagement to work through the infrastructure challenges that you need to run wires or pipes to be able to execute some of this. So I think on that, if you move past the plan creation and to the pathway to compliance, I think there's a lot of capacities there to address the things that are kind of frustrating the market's ability to bring alternative generation into the system.
Yeah, thanks. That certainly tracks. Abigail Mahaley's been quite patient here. I want to move to her question now. And you touched on this a bit when you talked about potential future roles for hydrogen, even though its initial place in the regulations has changed and was partially removed. But Abigail wonders if you can say a bit more about what technologies plants and operators might be able to use to meet the strictest CCS-based standards. In other words, are there other options aside from shuttering and emissions trading that meet that same threshold as 90% CCS?
I don't pretend to be the authority, any greater authority than many people on the call. So first of all, I think going mass-based and is an approach that's not shuttering but allowing to use a plant in the lower capacity that we've seen some owner operators using with their plants. I think that there are some technologies for CCS beyond just the post-combustion capture. We saw the Alum Cycle plant with Warren Buffett being discussed out, and I think it was Wyoming or Montana, as an alternative technology that could, with front-end gasification and an Alum Cycle that would get you there. But I think if you're running a coal plant past 2039, you'll need to have some sort of capture. I doubt that making a very low capacity asset with a mass-based cap is a long-term play, and I think you would need to find some carbon capture technology that would get you down to those levels.
Yeah, thanks. Cynthia asked a question that I think is important in its dynamism as it's happening in real time. We're seeing the end of flat demand growth and arguably a future of explosive demand growth with data centers as a major factor there. And that's geographically differentiated. Cynthia mentions Virginia, where the data center load and influence of AI is expected to triple or quadruple that demand in the future. So how much is that kind of load growth compromising, the ability to write a rule that reduces utility greenhouse gases without compromising reliability?
I'm surprised we got 49 minutes in before we started talking about the load growth projections. So, something about it says something about restraint, but it is a massive point of discussion right now in the sector. I do think it's we've had previous periods of high load growth in this country before, and we've managed them. But I do think we have to rise to the moment in terms of the things I talked about before. Many things are frustrating bringing on generating assets. We have a colleague who we're just talking with the other day, Jackson, working on the ERCOT approach of interconnecting, and can we look at that and put it more nationally so we can bring generating assets onto the grid. We don't want to lose sight on what we can do on energy efficiency to try and bend that curve as much as we can. I think this is a tremendously dynamic sector. There's so much change going through it right now, and then there's this we are electrifying other sectors of the economy, for environmental benefit, but it also brings us stress on load growth before, and we start getting into the need to do ChatGPT. And if you look at all that, I think EPA has written a rule that tries to address the dynamism of it, give some optionality so people can adjust to it, but still has to execute on the requirement that they control pollution in the atmosphere, and provides, I still have the reliability provisions on the screen, provides malleability in the rule. So as we go to this unknown future of exactly how much load growth are we going to have, exactly how much stress are we going to have, exactly how much can we bring other sources onto the grid, states and operators will have flexibilities. And I think that was the intent of, and the reason the EPA created the stress on this when they wrote the rule and discussed the rule, because they will acknowledge that none of us have perfect forecasting of where this reliability need is going to go, but they're trying to provide the flexibilities that are necessary to control for various scenarios in the future.
Yeah, thanks. We have an asked and partially answered question in the chat, but I want to put it to you anyway. Bob Stout asks about the range of greenhouse gas emissions reductions that EPA would estimate resulting from these rules, considering compliance schedules and various exceptions and flexibilities. And our colleague Brian has flagged the Energy Pathways USA report by Martin Ross and colleagues late last year that did put some numbers to this very question. And for those interested, you can see it in the question and answer function of the webinar. But Tim, I want to ask you about how that was discussed during the formation process of these rules, and how that dovetailed or expanded or was in service to larger emissions reduction goals, how that balance of kind of pragmatism with ambition was pursued in the process of developing the regulations themselves.
Appreciate the question. The short answer is EPA didn't look at what the long-term targets were. Very aware of them. The political appointees of the agency are appointed by the president. They know what the president has promised and desires in terms of emissions reductions, and they're very aware of them. But the statute doesn't allow or the agency to design a rule to meet a science-based target of emissions in the concentrations in the atmosphere. It requires the agency to assess what standard of performance can be justified by known demonstrated technology that could be brought to scale. And it's technology forcing, but it doesn't translate back to an emissions number, or you can't translate down from an emissions goal to a standard. You have to go bottom up, look at the technologies, look what's feasible, and then assess what that is. And I, in candor, don't even know what the projected reductions from these regulations are. Probably in corroboration of what I just described. That's not the driving metric by which EPA can justify regulation. But I know that even the full proposal, which had the existing gas fleet covered as well, was going to not meet the 50 to 52%, or the power sector's share of the Paris Accords target. And wasn't claiming to. What it was claiming to be is a a pollution abatement program required by the Clean Air Act that would drive, the sector in a clean direction, with the hope that private sector leadership, public investment from the IRA and BIL, and state leadership, and all would drive to meet those targets. So it's part of a larger portfolio approach that can be undertaken given the authorities and resources available to the government.
Thanks, Tim. I had one more question, but I actually think that that's an excellent place to land the plane here. We also have a bit of a clarification from our Nicholas Institute director, Brian Murray, who's going to offer a bit more color on those quantitative projections that are coming out of our shop on the potential impact of these regulations. Brian, we'll also hand over to you to offer some concluding remarks. Let me just say thank you to everyone in attendance and for your participation. Thanks especially to Tim for sharing knowledge and experience on this issue. And we look forward to contributing to successful implementation of these regulations as they move forward. So thanks much, Tim, and over to you, Brian.
Thanks, Jackson, and thanks, Tim, of course. Again, I'm Brian Murray, and I direct Nicholas Institute for Energy, Environment, and Sustainability here at Duke, which houses Energy Pathways USA. We also have a number of other initiatives that work with partners inside and outside Duke to convene experts and key decision makers to accelerate solutions to our foremost energy, environmental, and sustainability problems. You can find out more about the Nicholas Institute at nicholasinstitute.duke.edu. And then I believe an Energy Pathways USA link has also been dropped in the chat. I really want to thank my colleague, Tim Profeta, for expertly leading us through this complicated and somewhat nuanced dimensions of the EPA power plant rule in today's webinar. I want to thank Jackson Ewing, who directs Energy Pathways USA, for his skillful moderation, and Colette Watt for all the production work to make this webinar happen. And mostly to all of you for joining us today. The one amendment I did want to make in my comment in the chat was, so the EPA has issued a regulatory impact analysis of their rule. And in that rule, our interpretation of the emissions projection is that the baseline emissions were already slated to go down about 75% by 2045. And then with the rule, they'll go down about another 15%. Below 75%. So not adding 15 to make it 9, but you get my point. So EPA is taking a look at this. As Tim says, they're not, the rule as written is not intended to align with whatever the Paris Accord goals are, but with what the statutory authority the EPA has to regulate greenhouse gases in the power sector. So with that kind of final amendment of my comment, I really do want to thank you all and sign us off, and feel free to reach back out to us if you have any questions about this. And also stay tuned for other Energy Pathways work and webinars that we're going to be doing in the months that come ahead. Thank you.